Chapter 9, the Immune System and Mechanisms of Defense, Screencast 1. Now, this chapter focuses on the overall immune system, and think about how effective it must be. There are so many different types of bacteria, viruses, pathogens, all of those things, yet for the most part, we are relatively healthy. Although we are living in crazy times in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and so that will be something we spend some time also focusing on, because I think it's important to have an idea of this particular virus. Now, if we look at the defense mechanisms that the body has, the first, they're barriers. So kind of think of skin, okay, the stomach that has acidic contents, tears, vomiting, those are all preventing, okay, or neutralizing pathogens before they can do us any harm. There's non-specific defense mechanisms such as phagocytosis, inflammation, and then we have specific defense mechanisms, and this is the actual immune response, which enables the body to recognize and remove very specific bacteria, other foreign cells, tumor cells, and viruses, and involves antibodies and T cells. Of all of the immune responses, specific defense mechanisms are probably the most complicated. Now, a pathogen is going to be something that causes disease. That's important to keep in mind now. Those that are living include bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Non-living infectious particles are going to be viruses and prions. So keep in mind, viruses are not considered to be alive. Okay, so COVID is caused by a virus. Here you can see a number of very common bacteria. So panel A is streptococcus. So those of you that have experienced strep throat. Here we have E. coli, typically harmless. We find a colony in ourselves in our large intestine. And here we have Campylobacter jejuni, and this is one that's very common for cause of food poisoning. So lots of different types of bacteria out there. But the important thing to remember more than anything else, most bacteria are not pathogenic. Okay? The majority of bacteria do not present us any harm. If you eat yogurt, probiotics, any of those things, those are all things that have bacteria in them and cultures. Here we can look at a eukaryotic cell. So keep in mind we saw this previously. These are human cells. Here we have a bacterial cell, and notice a single strand of DNA and some small ribosomes and a plasma membrane, but no real organelles. And here we actually have a virus, and a virus is typically consists of a protein coat surrounding either RNA or DNA, and viruses function by hijacking the host. So if we look at bacteria, they're prokaryotic, so they don't have membrane-enclosed nucleus or organelles. They're single-celled, and they actually use a wide variety of resources for growth and reproduction. Examples of bacterial infections are pneumonia, tonsillitis, tuberculosis, botulism, toxic shock syndrome, syphilis, Lyme disease, etc. And these are generally treated through the use of antibiotics. Now, viruses, these are small. They are much smaller than bacteria. We are going to consider viruses to be non-living. They exhibit no metabolic activity, and they cannot reproduce without a host. Generally, they consist of either DNA or RNA, so not both, and that nucleic acid is actually surrounded by a protein coat called the capsid. Now, if we look at diseases caused by viruses, they include, let's put COVID-19 right there, AIDS, hepatitis, rabies, encephalitis, influenza, colds, warts, chickenpox, and Ebola hemorrhagic fever. So those are some examples of all viral infections. Now, keep in mind, viruses cannot be treated effectively by antibiotics. Antibiotics are specific to bacterial infections. Now, prions, Now, these are brain proteins that are not folded correctly. And what happens, the misfolding turns into a self-propagating, filling and disabling the cell with protein debris. Now, one of the things that happens, they are very resistant to cooking, freezing, drying. That will not kill them. And if we look at diseases associated with prions, bovine spongiform encephalitis, so mad cow disease, or variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, VCJD. So keep that in mind. One thing that has been noted in the Western New York area, you may have heard of zombie deer, and they're thinking that these are deer that are suffering from some type of prion disease. And if people see them, they're recommended to contact wildlife services to let people know that they've seen something along those lines. Now, the next thing we need to keep in mind here is some ways of characterizing how bad a potential pathogen can be. Now, transmissibility, how easily a pathogen is passed from one person to person. We do know that COVID passes pretty easily. Okay, that's why we're wearing masks, we're trying to social distance, all of those things in an effort to minimize transmissibility. Now, if we look at mode of transmission, so I'm going to be using, once again, COVID-19, droplets. Okay, that's the primary way in which COVID is transmitted from one person to another. So droplets, respiratory droplets, we're looking at fecal oral, body fluids, direct contact, but not necessarily airborne. It's basically those droplets, and that's once again why we recommend masks and also social distancing. Now, virulence is how much damage is caused by the infection. So some infections are far more dangerous than others, and they're very virulent and create wide damage. Ebola is a really good example of a very virulent viral infection. Now, the lymphatic system, this is an anatomical system, not one of the big ones. So this is not by far people's favorite system, but it is a very important system. And it has three primary functions. It's going to maintain blood volume within the cardiovascular system, so that keeps that pretty important. It's going to be responsible for the transport of fats and fat-soluble material from digestive system to the cardiovascular system. And then it also filters foreign material to defend us against infections. Here we can actually see some components. So these are the vessels. So it's another vascular system. The vessels in the lymphatic system are more like veins. Okay, we can look at lymph nodes here. Okay, so here we have the spleen, tonsils. Those are examples of structures found within the lymphatic system. Here we see the thymus, and this is where lymphocytes will mature. So we'll kind of come back to these a little bit later. Now, as noted, you want to think of the lymphatic system mostly vessels. Okay, so it's a network of vessels, and they are most similar to veins. They start off as these blind-ended capillaries. One thing to keep in mind, these capillaries are well surrounded by typical capillary beds. That's important to keep in mind because the lymphatic system is picking up excess fluid. Eventually, these vessels will drain into the cardiovascular system through the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Lymph itself, it's a milky fluid, and it contains white blood cells, proteins, fats, occasionally bacteria, viruses, and potentially tumor cells. Now, lymph nodes, these are located at intervals along lymphatic vessels. And what they do is they filter lymph. So they're removing microorganisms, debris, and abnormal cells from the lymph. They're very small. The nodes themselves are composed of connective tissue, macrophages, and lymphocytes. And as noted, they act as filters. One way of determining if you might have an infection when you go to the doctor's office, there's various areas they palpate. So they're palpating the cervical nodes, the axillary nodes, And if there's swelling there, there's an indicator that there might be an infection because white blood cells are actually proliferating in those areas, and that's why they're swollen. Now the spleen, that is the biggest of all lymphatic organs, and the job of the spleen is to filter blood. Okay, so lymph nodes filter lymph, the spleen filters blood. So make sure that you have that in mind. It's located within the left upper quadrant of the body, and if you look at the spleen, there's two general regions. One is the red pulp, and that's responsible for the removal of old and damaged red blood cells. Also, one thing that you may hear the spleen referred to as a blood reservoir. So it is an area where blood is stored temporarily. The white pulp, that's the part that has lymphocytes that are actually searching for pathogens. There are a number of diseases that actually cause the enlargement of the spleen. If you look at infectious mononucleosis, leukemia, my brother actually had his spleen removed as a consequence of his Hodgkin's disease. Okay? And the spleen is something that can be removed with minor medical impact. He's not subject to more infections or anything because of that. Now the thymus, this is where T lymphocytes mature. So think thymus T cells. It's located right behind the sternum above the heart, and once again, this is where T cells actually mature. There's going to be two hormones that control T cell development, thymosin and thymopoietin. The thymus is actually the largest and most active during childhood, and as we get older, the thymus actually atrophies and it becomes infiltrated by a lot of fat and fatty tissue. Tonsils, those are responsible for filtering food and air that enters the throat, and the adenoids, they actually are filtering air in the back of the nasal passages.